Hello and welcome to our second episode of Inside Indie, where we dive into the world of art house and independent cinema. That includes documentary and foreign features. Now, this is the second episode in our series, the third episode overall, with the pilot episode being 2 weeks ago and our first episode being last week. Now, if you notice, I'm a little quieter than the past two episodes, and that's because, I am staying with someone right now and they are currently sleeping, so I do not want to disturb their slumber. But I do have a lot to discuss, guys. Also, sorry for not starting at exactly 9 o'clock tonight. I had to take care of a few things before getting on ready for this podcast. So let's get started with today's episode. So I had a little bit of trouble coming up with the topic, honestly. I asked you guys on Facebook whether or not you want to come up with a topic or not. And I didn't get any responses, but I decided to come up with something instead. And today we're going to be discussing about what is a very special day in my heart, Art House Theater Day. Now, I'm not going over the history of art house cinema or art house theaters, as that would go on for way too long. And I think it would be a better video to do it. Plus, I didn't have the time to really do the whole research and everything. So I'm just going to discuss my opinion and my experience of art house theaters in general. So let's get this out of the way first. What is an art house theater? So an art house theater, in my mind, is a movie theater that does show movies that are not really part of the mainstream and are not really, made by big budget studios. For example, at art house theaters, you won't typically see Star Wars. You won't typically see like any Marvel movies, any DC movies for that matter. Rather, you're going to see movies on a smaller budget that are usually premiere at film festivals or that are from up and coming directors. Usually the budgets range anywhere from the low thousands to, the teens, millions maybe. A lot of awards contenders nowadays premiere at art house theaters. Art house theaters typically don't have a lot of screens. Typically the smallest will usually be one. The biggest will usually be like 4 or 5 maybe, at least around my area. That's what typically art house theaters are like. And I'm lucky. I live in an area that's close by New York City, so you'll at least get a couple art house theaters. Other parts of the country don't get any art house theaters due to the low demand for them. You'll be lucky if you even get a movie theater in some parts of the country. But anyhow, so with art house theaters, the movies themselves, tend to be, pretty abstract, pretty strange at points. Movies like Birdman, movies like, I don't know, Phantom Thread, which is not really strange, but it's not exactly something that is going to sell a lot of tickets. A typically good art house affair. A lot of foreign features and a lot of documentaries have been put into the art house boat too, since they aren't really part of the mainstream consciousness. Documentaries rarely top the box office charts, if ever. Foreign films, forget it. With the exception of some Bollywood films or really well-known foreign directors, they usually don't do well in the United States. I don't know how they do in other countries, but films that are not in the native language of a country, but in the United States, where the majority language is English, other parts it's Spanish, but for the most part, English is widely spoken. You won't get films that are spoken in any other languages because they don't usually typically do well. Whether it be for the opposite language, whether it be for the concepts, who knows? Or maybe for poor marketing. Because that's a lot of things. A lot of art house movies, unless they're trying to go for an award, they're usually not marketed well. And it's not because it's intentional, but it's because oftentimes art house and, for that matter, films that are low budget or indie films, for that matter, like films that are not from main studios, typically don't have a big budget to like advertise on billboards or to be on TV, for that matter. Usually they're done through the internet or through like posters. Now, when it comes to an art house theater, they tend to be at points a little more pricey than your typical movie theater. The reason for that is because, the theaters, they tend to get films that, they don't have these big deals or big contracts with the big studios. So in turn, they got to pay the rent somehow, and they're not owned by a corporation. Instead, it's, local. It's like, decently rich businessmen who afford these, but they're not like multi-millionaires or anything. From my experience, at least. Again, I could be completely wrong, but this is what I've noticed. Now, funny thing enough, my hometown doesn't really have any art house feeders, so I have to go outside into the cities to really go check them out. But yeah, where I live, there's this one good art house feeder called the Avon, which is out in Stamford. I've mentioned it on this show before, and they showed a movie that we will be discussing later on this podcast. But yeah, they have only 2 screens, but they tend to show movies that, like I said, they don't show Star Wars, but they show like a lot of indie films, a lot of documentaries, foreign features. They tend to show stuff that, again, really doesn't get played at the big theaters. I mean, maybe if it's really successful, but otherwise, no. And now, typically with an art house theater, you'll have some employees here and there, and they usually tend to work there for a long time, as the environment is usually generally considered better than most mainstream theaters, at least from my experience, for sure. And they tend to be more luxurious, like they tend to like put more details into the decor. New York City has a lot of art house and indie theaters for sure. There's plenty of them I can name off the top of my head. There is the Landmark, you have the Paris Theater, you have also to the Nighthawk Cinemas, which I haven't been to yet, but I will eventually. And then, of course, you have the Alamo Draft House, which is kind of like the biggest indie theater chain you could think of. So with Landmark too. I know they're chains, but they're not like, Regal or AMC for that matter, or around here, Bowtie. So yeah. And so I would like to say happy Art House Theater Day. It's one of my favorite holidays for sure. But let's get into my personal experience with the theaters for sure. Enough of the yapping for sure. And yep, and it looks like we got, okay, so, all right, so we got someone talking about Lord of the Rings again. It's the same guy from last week, really. Okay, sorry, Kate Keefe. I'm going to spoil your fun here, but we're not discussing about Lord of the Rings. This is an art house and indie movie, the podcast. So if you want to discuss Lord of the Rings, you may want to go to a different podcast. I'm sorry to burst your bubble here, but, this isn't the right podcast for you. All right, so anyhow, so one of my first experiences in going to an art house theater was back in, the first time I really ever went to an art house theater was back in 2010 when I went to the Avon in 2010, I believe. I was with my mom and her friend, and we watched a documentary about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I forget what it's called, but I'll bring it up one day eventually. My bubble has been burst. All right, sorry to hear that, Keith K. Yeah. Anyhow, but then in the modern landscape, let's fast forward now to 2016. Moonlight was just released, in several theaters across the country. Again, it had gotten sort of an early release before the nationwide release in Norwalk, which is about 15 minutes from where I live. It's a place called Garden Cinemas, which I would recommend going to if you get a chance to. It was around Veterans Day weekend, and I really wanted to see Moonlight, but I didn't want to wait a couple more weeks for it to come out to my local theater. So I decided, to go all the way to Norwalk to go see this. And boy, was it worth the wait, because the theater itself has 4 screens. Like I mentioned, art house theaters typically don't have a lot of screens. And this theater was so old-fashioned, they don't even accept debit or credit. And you can only pay in cash or like these paper gift cards, which let me see if I can pull it in my wallet right now, what it looks like. Because I got a bunch of these for like, a gift one time for graduation, I think. Yeah, this is what it looks like, a $10 gift card to Garden. Yeah, I still got to go to Garden at some point. I'm saving it for like the Oscar season. Save her. You saw nice. So anyhow, so yeah, I saw Moonlight there. By the way, I ended up seeing Moonlight 3 times. Not at Garden, but of course, I was seeing many other points. Anyhow, so then I saw a few weeks later. I went to go in early December. I went to go see Manchester by the Sea there, and it was a crowded show. Believe me, let me tell you, when that movie first came out, oh boy, was it busy. And, the tickets, I think there at the time, they still may be $11 per ticket. Avon is like 13 without membership. But I'm just going to say to you right now, it is totally worth the price because the staff is generally pretty nice. And also the movies that they show, like, again, you'll sometimes get in the mainstream theaters, because I think the only reason why the mainstream theaters got Manchester by the Sea and Moonlight was because they were awards contenders. Other than that, they would have not shown it. And then, there are movies, for example, like Fantastic Woman or The Party that I saw at Garden that you couldn't get at Fairfield. Well, first, Fantastic Woman was a foreign feature, and my local theater barely shows foreign features at all. And then with The Party, it's just way too obscure for it to be in, a mainstream theater for sure. The Party is what I would definitely call an art house film for sure. See, I'm just going to also say this right now. The difference between an art house film and an indie film is an indie film technically doesn't have a lot of money put into it. It does not supported by a major studio usually, or it's just supported by, a smaller version of a big studio. And, indie films, they can be really anything for sure, but they usually have small casts or pretty unknown casts for sure, low budgets, and they typically rely more on the writing or, really clever ways to use the camera on a low budget. Whereas art house films can be like indie, but in a sense they focus more on the aesthetic of the film instead of trying to, really, let me rewrite this. Let me rephrase this. Art house films tend to make it more as like a piece of art. They don't try to, entertain you necessarily. Rather, they try to, immerse you into the movie itself. They try to be colorful. They try to be different. They try to be odd. So, and The Party is what I would definitely call art house because it is strange. It is odd, but it is certainly intriguing. And of course, you would never see it in a mainstream theater because mainstream audiences would be confused by it. I'm not saying they're dumb. I'm just saying that, it may be a little confusing to some who are not that really much into movies. So yeah, and then my first time I went to Avon, which by the way is my favorite theater. Shout out to the staff there. My first time in the modern sense I went there was back September of last year in 2017 when I went to go see a movie called Beach Rats, which won Best Director at Sundance. And while I was disappointed by the movie overall, I liked the experience very much of Avon. I love the classic design that they brought back from the old 1930 style since the theater has been around since 1939. And I just love the fact that they show movies that really you don't get at mainstream theaters. Again, I can go on and on here, but I think I'm going to save it for a different podcast. So anyhow, yeah, sorry if I didn't come prepared that well with this, but this is just what I'm doing off the top of my head right now, and it's almost 9:30 at night. Yeah. So yeah, happy Art House Theater Day. If there's an art house theater near you that doesn't show any mainstream movies, go check it out. I mean, listen, dudes, check out something that's out of your range for sure. That's what I would definitely recommend. Don't just see the movies that are in 3,000 theaters opening weekend. Don't just see the movies that you're comfortable with. Go like something that's going to challenge you in a sense. Like I've seen plenty of movies that I never thought I would see in my lifetime, but I ended up enjoying surprisingly. So yeah, there's that. But now let's get on to the big part of this podcast, the part that a lot of people have been waiting for, and that is my review of the week. Now, in last week's podcast, I said that I was going to be discussing about Fahrenheit 11/9 by Michael Moore, and I got a chance to see it early at the Avon, and so I'm going to be discussing it. So, yeah, Fahrenheit 11/9 is Michael Moore's film about the election of 2016 between Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump and what led up to that election, what has happened after that, and the whole political climate of America. Now, as some of you may know, Michael Moore is, a very political director. He has his opinions about certain issues, and he's known to be very liberal in a lot of ways, almost to the point where it annoys a lot of people. Now, I'm not going to let you know about my political stance on this podcast since it's not a political podcast, but I will say that the film, on the filmmaking basis alone, it is a great documentary. It is informative, it is shocking, and it doesn't really shy away from, showing how kind of things are in this country, but at the same time, it is heavily biased to a point where it does get annoying a lot. Michael Moore doesn't really show the other side of the arguments at many points, though. I mean, he kind of does, but he just glosses over it for sure. I mean, Michael Moore is a great editor, too. I mean, I know he didn't edit the film, but since he did write it and direct it, he had a lot of influence into what goes into the final product. I mean, it is preachy at points. I will say that. Now, just so you know, people, this is going to get into spoiler territory since I have a lot to say about this film. So if you haven't seen Fahrenheit 11/9 yet, this is your warning. I will go into spoilers. So without further ado, let's get into details. So Michael Moore has not been a fan of Donald Trump ever since he first announced his presidency. Hell, he hasn't been a fan of Donald Trump really at all since like the 1990s. And Michael Moore, I feel like with this film, in a sense, like, the film was marketed as, an anti-Trump film, but in reality, it's kind of anti-establishment in a lot of ways. Because he, at one point in the film, talks about the Flint water crisis, and it's fitting for him since he is from Flint, Michigan. And there is a lot of shady corruption that went on during the Flint crisis. No matter what political side you were on, you have to admit it was pretty shady what goes on. And, I think that's probably the best part of his film, really, is talking about the Flint water crisis. Hell, I think his whole documentary should have probably been about that water crisis since it hits home to him and he knows a lot about the city of Flint. However, I feel like he tries to take on a lot of other issues, and he does it pretty well, too, the way how interesting it is. However, I just don't feel like there's a central focus of this film other than the establishment screwing over the people. And we've gotten plenty of films about that already. And now for full context, this is not my first Michael Moore film. The first film I saw by him was Bowling for Columbine, and I did have to watch that in high school, so that's how I got to know him. So yeah, but Fahrenheit 11/9, I only saw this film because it was probably the biggest indie release of the weekend. It's a documentary, so I figured why not talk about a documentary on the show? And unlike the last two episodes where I didn't have much to say about the films, this time I'm going more into detail. Now, with Michael Moore, he also talks about the Parkland shooting, and his stance is interesting there, although and he's not completely preachy like he is about like the whole Trump situation, which I will get into. But I feel like he just talked about the whole Parkland situation just so it could be somewhat relevant. I don't feel like he really talked about it just to connect with his overall theme. I mean, yeah, he shows how politicians kind of care about guns, but if you want to see his anti-gun film in a sense, watch Bowling for Columbine. That's really where he goes more into guns. Here, I think his Parkland segment is kind of like mini Bowling for Columbine in a sense. Doesn't go that deep, but it kind of is. So then let's talk about, his other segment, the big one about Donald Trump. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sick of the comparisons being made about Trump and Hitler. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but some could argue that there are a lot of similarities between Trump and Hitler, but I feel like it's not that the arguments made about Trump and Hitler that bother me. What bothers me is the fact that, that they use this and they try to force it down people's throats. At least the way Michael Moore does it. Again, like I said, I'm not against the idea of people comparing Trump to Hitler. I'm not. I've seen arguments being made about that, and I found some to be pretty interesting at points. However, the fact that when people like Michael Moore try to make it seem like it's the absolute truth and that no one other's opinions matter, that's when I start to have a bit of a problem. Because again, Michael Moore's films are pretty biased, and I knew going into Fahrenheit 11/9 that it was going to be biased, but I think his bias is pretty high here. It's some of the highest I've ever seen in a documentary for sure. And let's see now. Again, I feel like most of his film, but when I think about this film in a sense, I feel like the Parkland situation and the whole Trump situation, now that you really think about it, it was more of a selling point for this movie. His movie was actually about the whole Flint water crisis, which I think if he would have cut out the Trump and the Parkland stuff, I feel like but since he added in so much unnecessary stuff, which again, was still not bad, honestly, at points. It wasn't bad. I mean, honestly, I found it kind of funny, when when Michael Moore took a Nazi speech and put like some of Trump's audio over it. I mean, I know I said I wasn't going to get political here, but I found that kind of funny. I find that kind of stuff funny. But still, there is a heavy bias. Yeah, he does use music to try to manipulate like any filmmaker would. And there's this one scene where he uses. If you ever see the trailer for Fahrenheit 11/9, there's this one scene where after the movie gets its release date, and there's a lady that says coming soon to a city near you. That was actually taken the context of that situation came from a clip where in which the lady was talking about how Flint was being used as a military training ground, and she said coming soon to a city near you. I found that kind of to be a cheap move. Like, really, Michael, you would use a lady talking about military interference in a city and use that for a selling point in a movie? Yeah, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, so here's what I'm going to say to you about Fahrenheit 11/9. I'm going to say this. If you like Michael Moore already, you're probably going to really like this film. But if you're new to Michael Moore in a sense, be warned of the heavy bias for sure. And also be warned about, what he does to try to convince his audience about his topic in a sense, because sometimes it could feel very preachy. It could feel very manipulative at points. But his filmmaking, in a sense, like the way he chooses to, tell his story, it is very informative, I will say, and it opened my eyes about stuff that I didn't even know about. So yeah, I will say that Fahrenheit 11/9, while it is not the worst, while it is not like sorry people, I'm having a little hard trouble saying this. I've been talking for over 20 minutes straight with no one to back me up, but whatever. So here's my point, right? So here's my final argument about Fahrenheit 11/9. I would say it's a pretty good documentary overall, but I feel like there were some points where it could have been cut out and just made more about the Flint water crisis. Also, it was interesting too, before I forget, he talked about the whole teacher strike that went on in West Virginia and talked about some progressive candidates running for office. And I found that to be pretty interesting. I'm glad he gave that a shout out too, but I feel like that could have been a separate documentary on its own. So overall, I'm giving Fahrenheit 11/9 a 7 out of 10. So I guess, it's not the best documentary of the year for sure, but it may be worth checking out if you're interested in the Michael Moore or the current political situation in the U.S. Well, that is it right now for this episode of Inside Indie. Stay tuned next week where we'll be talking about the movie Lizzie with Chloe Sevigny and Kristen Stewart. Yep, I'll be discussing that in next week's podcast. And if you guys have any ideas for any topics for next week, let me know in the comments below. Also, if you want to be a host on Inside Indie, please message me and I will get back to you to see if you'll be the right host for the show. The podcast usually is around Sundays at 9 o'clock. And we discuss usually a topic of the week while discussing a movie. And in order to be a host, you have to see this. We both have to see the same movie at some point during the same week before the podcast so we can have a discussion about it. So, yeah, so more details will be through email. So, till again, this is Ian signing off, and have yourself a great day, everyone.